Welcome guys to a brand new series. This is based on a deep dive and I'm going to be covering as much facts and as much interesting things as I can about the GX 4000. This video today is going to be covering the cartridge releases, and nothing has more disinformation and is wrong than the cartridge releases. You look on somewhere like Wikipedia and they seem to suggest that 20 cartridges was released just in 1990, and anyone who owned a GX 4000 in 1990 would tell you that you certainly went into a retailer, you certainly didn't have a choice of 20 cartridges. In fact, the very slow production was the issue with the GX 4000, and they just couldn't pump enough games in. Now, Amstrad believed this themselves as well. When you look at these release schedules, they thought that 20 games would be released that year as well in 1990, but unfortunately, the manufacturer of the cartridges, Trojan Products, just did not have the capability to do that. In fact, when you look at the actual releases, they only seem to be able to produce and release 2 games a month, and this is quite odd. They seem to be able to produce a little bit more when the production rates went down, but Amstrad insisted that all these wonderful cartridges that a manufacturer had to pay up front for 20,000 cartridges. And of course, when the publishers realised that the GX 4000 and the Plus machines are sold so badly, they threatened to cancel their games. But of course, I'll cover this more in part 2. But this is part 1, and this is covering the games that were released in 1990. So there was a bit of an issue straight off in September. This game here, the packing game, Burning Rubber, Ocean had struggled to get it done in time, and this was pretty catastrophic at the start for Trojan Products, as they had the ROM masters for 11 games complete. They could easily have put on the production lines. The reason why they didn't do this is because they needed Burning Rubber. They needed hundreds of thousands of cartridges to put into the GX 4000s. And because Amstrad insisted on 20,000 cartridges, they couldn't exactly start and just stop mid-production. So Burning Rubber came in late and just hit the production line in time, but this had already caused a delay. So a lot of the games that was released early 1991 should have been released in 1990. But of course, Amstrad were a little bit silly themselves, because it was a lot of pressure on a relatively new company that were making the cartridges to put that much pressure on Trojan Products. They did struggle. They moved to a new facility in 1990, and it was quite a lot for them, and they did make some catastrophic errors, which I'll be covering over. So we get to September, and you walk into your retailer, and you had Fire and Forget you could have bought with your brand new GX 4000. And most magazines reviewed this at the time. Amstrad Action gave this a whopping 94%. Now, Fire and Forget by no means is a terrible game, but it's not a great game either. And let's be honest, the packing game Burning Rubber was better than Fire and Forget. Then we get to October, and then we had Batman and Barbarian 2. Now, these were very, very similar to the standard CPC version. So anyone walking in would have been, the retailers would have been a bit disappointed by this. And then things were not a lot better in November, where we had Operation Thunderbolt and Crazy Cars 2. Now, the most interesting thing about this is you look through magazines at the time, and no magazines were reviewing Batman, Barbarian 2 or Operation Thunderbolt. Now, Ocean, as you can see by this article, New Computer Express, which is actually the magazine I get a lot of these dates from, New Computer Express were incredibly fascinating. They spoke to Amstrad, they spoke to Trojan Products, and they spoke to the publishers. They were also able to get cartridges to review the moment that they were coming off the production lines. So that was very fascinating, and this is the reason why I have most of the dates that I have now. Of course, they spoke to Ocean, and Ocean claimed that Amstrad hadn't given any review copies for Barbarian 2, Batman, and Operation Thunderbolt, hence why these cartridges were not reviewed in magazines at the time. Now, I don't want to be saying that this is false. It could very much be true, but knowing that Batman, Barbarian, Operation Thunderbolt would not have done very well in reviews, it seems a bit weird that all the other cartridges were reviewed by magazines. Fire and Forget certainly was reviewed, and then Crazy Cars 2 was. The same with Switchblade and No Exit, so it seems a bit strange that Ocean didn't receive any copies to send out for reviews, but who am I to say that who's fake and who's lying on this one, and who's telling the truth? Of course, Crazy Cars 2 was out, and that was a bit better. Not too much, but when we got to December, we got Switchblade, which out of all these games you can see here is a really good game, and in fact it's one of my favourite games for a GX4000. And No Exit, but that was a French exclusive. So Amstrad were hoping in 1990, going up to Christmas, that this console and the Plus machines would be a massive success. But you look at the games that were sent out for reviews, the games that weren't, and the games that were released, this was not a great lineup. They had a few months to flood the shops with cartridges and games, but these games weren't impressing anyone, to be honest. And the worst was to come in January, when Switchblade and No Exit, Trojan Products, mixed the ROMs up. Now, this didn't happen to every cartridge, but there was certainly more than a few people who were sending back their Switchblade carts after Christmas. This was not a great year for Amstrad by any stretch of the imagination. So their 20 games ended up just 7. In the next part, I'm going to be covering 1991, and things weren't great in 1991 either. Welcome back to part 2, and this is the cartridges that was released in 1991. Now, we did have quite a large batch of games, but we have to bear in mind that this was the last retail releases when we get to November. So we start in January, and we only had one game released. That was RoboCop 2. Now, this is a really good game. Rock hard, but the graphics are very 16-bit. It's really uses a lot of the advanced hardware, a lot of hardware sprites, color palettes. It is a very good game. But again, as previously mentioned, with No Exit and Switchblade, there was an issue with RoboCop 2, and that was that there was killer cartridges. And what do I mean by this? You would put your cartridge, a RoboCop 2 in, and it will brick your Amstrad. Your GX4000 would literally just die. And this was quite an issue for quite a lot of the cartridges. And this did cause quite an issue. And then, but very good game. You might be thinking, there's 2 World of Sports there. Now, you're looking at this. I've seen a lot of previews of this in old magazines, World of Sports, and the original ones was always red logo. This is a French exclusive, but again, as we've talked about killer carts for RoboCop 2, this was a mistake. The games here, some of these games were on the cartridge, some of them aren't. And as you can see by this article, Amstrad were very insistent on all the games looking the same. All the images on the back had to be from in-game footage. Now, these are 16-bit Amiga. So, and Californian games. So, this obviously was a mistake, and we ended up with the more common variant, which is Off-Roader Sports, which come out in Europe. Now, funnily enough, this is more common in France as well, where we had that weird variant. So all we could think of is that Trojan Products had made the mistake. They've either done an old case or were sent the wrong one, and rather than just skip it all, they've just redone it. So this is probably, when you think about it, the most common cartridge with the biggest production run. Of course, the GX4000, it was quite famous at this point in magazines, and the Plus machines were really struggling. Amstrad's original insistence on 20,000 had really began to annoy the publishers, because that was a lot of money to put on the line, a lot of cartridges that they just weren't selling. We get to March and we had a bit better time. We had the 2 tennis games. These were and are good games. They do make use of the advanced hardware, and they're better than the CPC games. They're very good. Now, you might be thinking, what's Special Criminal Investigation here for? Now, I don't own the cartridge. I just own the case and the manual, unfortunately. And this is a very rare game. But something interesting happens when we get to April and May. The publishers had a big dispute with Amstrad, and we can read a little bit about it here. Now, Chase HQ was due for release in May. It was reviewed in magazines, most of them in May. It turned up in magazines as a pre-buy in May, but it's got pulled off production. And why is this? Well, as you can see by this review here, this is in a French magazine that Ocean were interviewed, and Pang, Navy SEALs, Plotting, and Special Criminal Investigation HQ2 were all finished and ready for cart duplication. But because Amstrad insisted on the 20,000 before they could get their carts done, they threatened to pull all their games. So, in my opinion, Special Criminal Investigation had hit the production line, and then it got pulled. So we can take that one away. So then we get to April, where we had Clax and Tintin on the Moon. Again, how do we know these games were released then? Well, New Computer Express. Again, they had the ROMs and they were sent them from the Trojan Products duplication lines. So anyone who wants to have any facts on the cartridge crisis, honestly, just read the articles. They are incredibly fascinating. But no, we had Clax and Tintin on the Moon, and these weren't given very good reviews. They were not great games. Clax was okay just because fundamentally it was a good game and it did have a few improvements, but Tintin on the Moon was just terrible in pretty much a direct port of what was a very poor CPC game. So then we get to Dick Tracy and Wild Streets. Now, you can obviously tell that the publishers had won. Amstrad had to relent, because all these 4 games are much more rarer than all the games that we had before it. And Dick Tracy is an insanely rare game to get. But I do tend to think that Wild Streets and Dick Tracy and Tintin on the Moon are hard games to get because they just weren't very good. So then we get to June and July, and we had Navy SEALs and Pang. We finally had really quality cartridges, really good games, but we had some devastating news, mostly in the UK, because it didn't affect France so much, but Comet and Dixon's in June, July had made big reductions, and they were basically discounted all the GX4000 stock. This was basically coming to the end of the line for Amstrad and the Plus machines, most likely in England, but France was beginning to struggle a bit now as well. But we only had one game after that was released in retail shops, and that was Plotting. After this, the only where you could buy games were independent retail shops. Then we had an exclusive in August, that was Mystical. And I've covered these games recently. Pinball Magic, Super Pinball Magic, and Panzer Kickboxing. These were both October games. And then the last commercial release in shops was Copter 271. These last games, we don't know what the production run was on them, but all these games here are very rare for the GX4000. The Plus machines in would be some of the last games you'll collect, so we know that cart duplication limit was very small. Of course, after Copter 271, presumably Trojan Products, who made the cartridges, and Amstrad had very little orders, because there was nothing released in 1992, unfortunately. But these is what the games that were released, and quite sad times really. But production issues, mistakes by Amstrad had caused this for catastrophic fails. So this was all the games that was released in 1991. Next I'll be covering the games that was released in 1993. And this is the third and final part. This is covering the games that was released in 1993. Of course, the last game that rolled off the Trojan Products production line was in November 1991, which was Copter 271. Nothing was released in 1992. Everyone just thought that the GX4000 and the Plus machines were completely dead at this point. And then this weird thing happened, and it is odd. It is the Trojan Light Phaser that was due for release in 1990. Amstrad Action advertised this, and it was exclusive to a company, a mail order company named Trading Post. So this literally came out of nowhere. And of course, when you look at the package itself, it clearly didn't come off the production line in 1993. That's because the cartridges, these labels, are a second generation label before Amstrad had made the final design. In fact, a lot of these ended up in the demo carts that was made in 1990. So, best guess was that Trojan Products in 1993 had come across these in the back of their warehouse. Originally, they had planned to release them in 1991 or 1990. And because of the backlog of cartridges they had, and by the time they kind of got around to it, the GX4000 had died. And in 1993, they're like, okay, we need to sell these. And then we also had Chase HQ2 that appeared in a couple of mail order companies in 1993. Now, that is an oddity because Ocean had long abandoned the Amstrad platform. Of course, they invested a lot of time and money, and it just didn't work. There's no way that they would have paid for a couple of hundred copies of Chase HQ2 in 1993. So my best guess is that in April or May in 1991, when there was the big dispute with Amstrad about cart duplication, that this was pulled from the production line. We don't quite know how many copies there was made or cart duplicated, but given the fact that so many years has passed and we've only found 3 copies, best guess is it wasn't that many. Of course, this is all very rare package. In 1993, there was very, very little interest in the Amstrad GX4000 and Plus machines. All what you see here sold very, very badly. And these are incredibly rare now. I'd love to get the cartridge myself for Chase HQ too, but I got a feeling I'm going to have quite a long wait on my hands. So this is all the cartridges that was released in 1991, 1990, and of course 1993. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video.